The 24th of January, the Media Center Ukraine of Ukraine Forum is going on with its work. My name is Svetlana Cheporenko. We are speaking about war crimes of Russian occupiers against religious communities and clergy. Today we have Viktor Yelensky, head of the State Service for Ethnic Policy and Freedom of Conscience, Yevgeniy Zakharov, director at the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group, Vyacheslav Likhachev, expert council member of the Center for Civil Liberties, and Ruslan Khalikov, religious studies scholar, head of the Religion on Fire project, the workshop for academic study of religion. So, Vyacheslav, obviously, Russian Federation did not invent the crimes which it now commits against clergy, against our religious values. Story shows that such barbaric crimes used to be committed by the occupiers during different periods of time. Why is it important to speak about them now, and what do they witness about? Thank you, and hello everyone. Yes, really. Both in the modern political history of Russian Federation and historically, the religious crimes were one of the sustainable, systematic practices in the Russian Empire, in the Soviet Union, in the modern Russian Federation. Why is it important now, and why is it important in the context of Russo-Ukrainian war? Well, among others, because the foreign policy arena, Russia is trying to create an image of an old-style, traditional empire which takes care of conservative values. And we need to confess that in the world, lots of conservative religious circles are still listening to this propaganda. Russia looks like an alternative to the modern popular left liberal Western world, and it looks attractive in the eyes of a conservative part of international community. It is not logical, it's not natural, because in fact, as we will see and will hear from our speakers, the crimes by religion against the clergy, against the belief is the systematic Russian practice, and we can see that obviously during the last 2 years of the full-scale invasion, but we've seen it for 10 years at the previously occupied territories. So we can speak about systematic and massive phenomenon of also religious crimes, and it's important from the point of view of international humanitarian law, because the educational institutions and medical institutions and religious buildings have a protected status from the perspective of the international humanitarian law. So systematic destroying of religious buildings is a war crime. And as we'll hear from our speakers, this practice is about hundreds of religious buildings which were either damaged or destroyed during the combats. And finally, Russia is trying to create an image of a protector of canonic traditional orthodoxy. But as we will see and hear, not only the representatives of such groups as Jehovah's Witnesses, but certain Protestant communities or Muslim communities are also affected on the territories occupied by Russian Federation. And also the representatives which Russian Federation is considering traditional denominations. But as for the damaged and destroyed religious buildings, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church recently of Moscow Patriarchate saw the biggest number of destroyed or damaged religious buildings, churches and communities during the combats and on the occupied areas. I will not take much of your time because you will hear the reports from our esteemed experts. Thank you. Thank you, Viktor. It's obvious that Russia and Russian Federation is at war against the population, in particular with religious communities. What do you think? Why? Those arrests of the clergy, destroying the religious values, why do the occupants do that? And which objective do they try to achieve? Thank you, Svetlana and Vyacheslav. I would like to start with one remark. which I never planned before, but which was mentioned by Vyacheslav. Really, Russia is trying to represent itself at the international arena among the conservative Protestants, evangelists in the United States and in other parts of the world as the protector of traditional values. Russia, let me say this remark, it is never in any other way can be considered a protector of traditional values, at least because it is, as we say, a champion on abandoned children, on crimes against 100,000 of population which are registered, on suicides, on alcoholism, alcohol addiction. One of the lowest level of donations to the volunteer and charitable initiatives in Russia. Russia has one of the lowest indicators of religious behavior. That is, people are rarely going to churches. People are showing a very low religious behavior. Now about your question. Russia, at least contemporary Russia, is an imminent enemy of the freedom of any manifestation of free will and freedom of conscience and free thoughts. And religious organizations, at least in Ukraine, are the alternative centers. Those are the people who cannot agree silently, or even not silently, they cannot agree with those pseudo-values and those ideologies which are imposed by Russian Federation. That is why, instantly after the beginning of the war, in February 2014, where Russia Federation came, religious freedom ended, and the Protestants and the Kyiv Patriarchate in the Crimea were just shocked by the laws which existed in Russian Federation. We couldn't even now imagine how much, to what extent they have the over-regulated control over religious life, and to what extent whoever does not belong to Moscow Patriarchate is harassed, and even those who belong to Moscow Patriarchate or can change the formula of prayer not for the victory of Russian armament but for peace, they are instantly persecuted. As soon as Russia came to the Crimea, its first victims were the evangelists, Baptists. Some of them had to leave the peninsula like the whole community, like the community at Balaclava, close to Sevastopol. The Jehovah's Witnesses were instantly banned, and Pentecostals as well as the clergy of Kyiv Patriarchate. During the invasion of the Strelkovs insurgents at Donbass, during the first months there were some of the executions of priests, very demonstrative clergy executions. During the Trinity, 4 Pentecostal deacons were shot, and when the Ukrainian army came there, they found their bodies in the mass grave. In Mariupol, a head of the Council of Churches and Religious Organizations was killed, Mr. Skorobohach. So whatever could be shown by Russian world in the freedom of conscience was shown even before the beginning of the Great War, the full-scale invasion. In fact, in the separate regions of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, evangelical Christians were banned. They were either announced Ukrainian or American spies, and their media are just full of those slogans, how they will kill all of them. Since the beginning of the Great War, the full-scale invasion, the terror against the clergy, against the believers, against all the centers of religious centers was strengthened for multiple times. Even in March of 2022, we could see this unfortunately huge martyrologist which was formed already. One of the priests, Maxim Kozachina, was shot when he was in the liturgy attire as a priest. Lots of them were affected by shellings. Lots of them were captured. Obviously, when we will be listening about the list of the people, the priests and pastors who got captured into captivity. Everything is done for not a single Ukrainian centers, the freedom-loving centers, which witness about real freedom of thought and conscience and belief. They do it so as that couldn't grow on the land which was occupied. Thankfully, we can also speak about the opposition, which is also done by our priests, this resistance on the occupied territories, by the evangelist Christians, Baptists and Pentecostals, and I already mentioned about the Orthodox and Catholics. This resistance is severely stopped and suppressed, but lots of our priests and pastors are staying with their flock, with their congregation and parish. They provide the physical and spiritual and material help during these hard times. Thank you. Viktor already brought us to the topic directly of religious persecutions. Yevgeniy, could you tell more about what is taking place on the occupied areas and which persecutions? You would like to speak about religious buildings? Okay. Ruslan, could you please tell what is happening with the religious buildings on the occupied territories? And could you please tell how Russia destroys our religious shrines? Thank you. Could you show my presentation? I have several slides. Thank you. So, dear colleagues, I thank you for the opportunity to express. I'll present several slides. Really, this is just the data of the recent 2 years of the war. That is since February 2022 till today, which can be found in the database of our project, Religion on Fire, on the destroyed religious buildings. And really, rather often the shelling which Russia commits against Ukrainian territory are not selective. They are striking everywhere, and their weapons are not of high precision, and they are ready to sacrifice anything to achieve their objectives. Rather often, the religious buildings are under fire, as well as hospitals, schools, or residential blocks. Sometimes, in some cases of shellings, we can say vice versa, that the religious buildings were the objects of shelling, in fact. And rather often we can see that this could be the chapel or the temple which was on this territory for a long time. It can be found on the maps. We know that the maps of the Russians are obsolete, but most of the churches are on the maps because they used to be there during the Soviet times. So definitely they can be found on the maps, and they knew about those churches. There can be cases in Irpin, for instance, or Severodonetsk, or some other places and settlements where there was intelligence working, And people witnessed that they had the intelligence by drones first. The Russians saw what is taking place on the territory, or, for instance, when this religious building is located separately from others. They do not have it too close to some other buildings, or a potential checkpoint or a barrack at some remote distance. This could be a kind of a religious object in the middle of the park or far from any other building, and still it is shelled. So we may say that, in fact, this is the conscious shelling of certain religious objects. Such cases take place. And altogether, if we speak about, in fact, the destroyed and damaged religious buildings by the combats, the biggest number of such buildings are in the regions where the combats are taking place. As of today, we calculated approximately 530 religious buildings which got under shelling. Within our project, we are monitoring all of that, and some of them were shelled sometimes several times and were destroyed in the end of the day. So the biggest number is more than 100 in Donetsk Oblast. A big number is in Kyiv region, more than 80. As for Luhansk and Kharkiv regions, it's more than 60 religious buildings damaged. In Kherson region, more than 55. As for Zaporizhia region, more than 30. Sumy region, Chernihiv, Mykolaiv regions, and Dnipropetrovsk regions, we can also see dozens of religious buildings damaged. But in the remote regions, religious buildings could be shelled as well, including Ternopil, Odessa, Zhytomyr regions, Vinnytsia region, and so on. So all over the territory of Ukraine, in different regions, which are sometimes even remote from the front line, it is systematic that the religious buildings were shelled. As for denominations, as it was already mentioned today by my colleagues, the vast majority, at least the half of all of the registered cases of damaged religious buildings, are the temples of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So we may say that protecting so-called religious values, traditional values, and orthodoxy, Russians are shelling the Orthodox temples, and without even trying to make them intact. But still, lots of Protestant religious buildings are under shellings, at least a third of what we registered, a bit less than a third, in fact. And this statistical data witnesses that, as for the settlements of the east of Ukraine, for instance, we have fewer Greek Catholic churches, but more of Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate and Protestant denominations. Still, religious buildings of, for instance, Judaism and Muslim religions are under shelling as well, and even Hinduism, like in Donetsk and Luhansk regions, there were shellings with even casualties, and of different denominations. No one is still without the attention of Russians. As for the damaged religious buildings, statistical data tell us that approximately a quarter of the temples and churches which were damaged they cannot be even used after that. Either they are fully destroyed or they got really severe damage. Maybe just one wall is left or a couple of walls is left, all of the rest is ruined. But not all of them. In some of them there were incoming shells, but still they were damaged but not destroyed. They could be repaired, and lots of them are already repaired, including Kyiv region, where the combats have ended already. As far as I know, more than a dozen of temples or churches were restored after the shellings. And let me also tell about the religious buildings. Not only shellings are the violation of the international humanitarian law. In particular, very often the Russian troops, are instrumentalizing and militarizing religious objects. It is also a systematic phenomenon which emerged all over the territory which was under occupation. And specifically, the military objects were there, either the headquarters or the warehouses or the stocks of armament. It was done in Bucha, in Melitopol, in Kharkiv region, in Malakomyshuvacha, in Chernihiv region. So in different regions where Russian army came, we can register that they're using churches as either the military warehouses or an Orthodox church. The bell tower is used for the snipers. So such cases can take place in different regions. It means that this is the systematic policy. And even before that, since 2014, as for the occupied territories, the Russians took religious buildings, but not for the armament or weapons warehouses, but for their own needs. Starting with, for instance, the reserve of Donetsk Church of Jesus Christ, and in the modern conditions, there was the well-known case in Yakimivka of Zaporizhia region when the whole of the Jehovah's Witnesses was reshaped as the club of military patriotic upbringing of youth, and all the Russian TV channels came to see this happy event, how the American spies were taken away and the club of young army was created there. So the destroyed objects are there, and the use for the military purpose of the religious buildings is the systematic practice which can be found on all of the territories. Those are not just separate cases which witnesses about the violation of the international humanitarian law. Thank you. Let us come back to the topic of persecution of the leaders of religious communities. Yevgeniy, could you tell more about the facts which are registered on the temporarily occupied territories? Thank you. I will start with the following. All of the data which I will mention now are taken from the database of the Initiative Tribunal for Putin, which was created on the 24th of March 2022, and where we collect information about the possible war crimes and crimes against humanity all over the territory of Ukraine. More than 10 organizations. The three main founders of that is our organization, Kharkiv Human Rights Group, the Center of Civil Freedoms, and Ukrainian Helsinki Human Rights Union. So altogether, more than 20 organizations are taking part in this process. I need to say that each of the incident in the database has the following data. That is the location, that is in fact the address or any location data, this is compulsory, the date of an event, and if we don't know the date specifically, the period of time when this event could have happened, the type of the event, the description of the event, the type of the object which was under attack. Besides that, we provide the preliminary qualification of this crime by the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and we substantiate the data with media files and other text documents which can be evidence of this crime, possible crime, and personal data, if we know them, of the ones who were affected, the witnesses, those who committed this crime, if we could identify them, and so on. So, as of today, in our database, we have more than 65,000 crimes. As for religious buildings, those are 343. They are fewer than we just saw in the presentation from Ruslan, but I may say, I already had enough time to see that in 5 regions we do not have data about the attacked religious buildings. And in 5 regions we have more information, so we should verify our data and compare with yours to improve the quality of our database and yours as well. And now let me move to, in fact, the people. How we sought for the clergy, the priests. We did it with the help of the search on keywords. Those were the words like the root of the word priest, and it was 41 incidents, pastor, 18 incidents, monk, 11 incidents, and in fact, abbot, 3 incidents. Altogether, there were 73 incidents. The search on keywords like mosque, synagogue, and temple didn't give us additional information. The analysis of these incidents, of these 73 ones, in 23 cases among them, the priests were mentioned without the connection with the committed crime. So the crime did not concern them. As the result, we had 50 episodes left in our database which were relevant. In 2 cases, the priests were killed on purpose. One case of those was already mentioned by Viktor Yelensky. When Maxim Kozachino was killed, though he was in the attire, in the liturgy attire. In 5 cases, the priests were killed in the result of the bombardment by different types of weapons. This could be artillery and missiles and so on. In 8 cases, they were wounded as the result of these attacks. 20 priests were kidnapped, and we don't know their location in the majority of cases. This is a huge issue I will mention later. 5 priests were kidnapped and eventually freed or liberated. And all of them, after they moved back to the governmentally controlled areas or after the occupation, they told that they were severely tortured. One of the priests was deported. He was driven away from his native town. He is 74 years old. That is his native town. If I'm not mistaken, it was Melitopol. And we don't know anything about his further fate. He was just banished as if he was a Ukrainian propagandist and so on. In one case, as for the database, we found what Ruslan told us about. The whole parish and the priest were taken away from the church, and they took the premises for their own needs. In one more case, the Russians fully took everything what used to be in the church. They brought out everything, and even the religious shrines. And in one more case, the Russians put their artillery close to the church, and after the request of the priest to move to another building, they denied that he could do that. They refused. It's also a war crime, what was done there. So, in fact, this is the list I mentioned here. If we speak about the kidnapped, the majority of them are the priests of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, and also those are different Protestant churches. They had kidnapped cases of kidnapping as well. 2 priests were kidnapped in Berdyansk of Greek Catholic Church. They were accused that they created a kind of an underground warehouse of armament, and the local resistance used that. They both stated they never did anything like that. So, in a nutshell, they said that it was just invented. It was not true. But because of that, they were taken under arrest. And what's interesting, the church was taking care about their fate. They wrote a letter to the Pope, and the Pope wrote to Russia about those 2 priests, and the Pope's statement was fully ignored. As of today, I'm dealing with that, with this case of two people. One of them is now in Sevastopol city, that is Father Bogdan Vileta. The second one, Ivan Levitsky, is now in the penitentiary institution not far from Rostov city. I have certain information that Mr. Heleta was forced to state as if it was true that they really had the warehouse there, and maybe he would be exchanged as a prisoner. Though it is impossible to check this information, all of those are just rumors. As for Father Ivan Levitsky, he did not acknowledge anything, so they would like to put him to trial. We can just imagine the trial if he did not acknowledge anything. So, of course, not a single lawyer was allowed to take part in this so-called investigation. So far, this situation is totally uncertain about them. As for the others, priests and clergy, I don't have more information than that they were kidnapped, and we don't know anything about their location, unfortunately. We need to confirm their location still. It is one of our tasks, and we will try to search for them, where they are now, what is their further fate in jail, and so on. I think that's it from me. Of course, I can name other certain cases and examples. Maybe I should mention about the killing of the priest. Oh, you were already told about the case of Mr. Kozachina. The second case of this murder, just a moment. I somehow skipped it. Okay. That is about Father Rostislav Dudarenko. He was killed on the 5th of March 2022. The Russian military fired against the checkpoint, which was located at the entrance to the village of Yasnohorodka. And Father Rostislav was going to the Russian military, and he took a cross in his hands and rose his hands, and he was shot. This is the second story of a murder of a priest. What other facts could be mentioned here? That in Kherson we have a famous priest and activist who has the name of Serhiy Chudinovich. He is from Orthodox Church of Ukraine. He suffered during the previous stage of the war. He used to be in Donbass, and here he was affected as well. He was kidnapped, severely tortured, but then they freed him, let him go in several days. He became a volunteer after that, after the beginning of the Great War, the full-scale invasion. That's it. I guess that's it from me. If there are any questions. Thank you so much, Yevgeniy. So if there are any questions among the journalists, please, you can pose them now. There is a question. Yes, hello, Artem Moskalenko, Ukrinform. I would like to ask you which measures are taken to protect the religious buildings from Russian aggression? Whether there are any specific measures for that? Do you mean at the governmentally controlled area? Yes, I mean from Russian shellings. Are there any ways to protect the religious buildings? Well, I know the priests who are using the conventional measures like sandbags, They are covering the windows. Sometimes it's not that easy because you can imagine they're huge. They're trying to equip the shelters in some of the churches. It was already mentioned by Ruslan, it seems, that after the liberation of Kyiv region, there were attempts, well, not even attempts, but really some of the churches were restored, and when they were restored, they took into consideration that again they could be, in fact, shelled. There is an international project which is for the monuments and architectural ones which are fully destroyed. Like in Brovary district, in Peremoha village, there is the church of the 19th century which was fully burnt as it was wooden. And when they restore these churches, of course, the builders are trying to take into consideration that they could be shelled again. But altogether, the religious buildings are really fragile and vulnerable. They are rather high and tall. Sometimes they are chosen as in fact, a target, and even as a landmark. It is hard to protect them. I'd like to add one more point. Besides the clergy, we could also see the ordained clergy. Just usual employees of religious organizations were affected. The teachers, for instance, or theologians. Among them, a famous expert on ancient languages, Ivan Kisluk, was killed in Bucha as well. The same happened with the rector of the seminary in Irpin. Obviously, we need to take that into account because those are crimes against religion, crimes against the freedom of conscience. As for Kisluk, used to be a unique person who was a teacher in the seminaries and academies in spite of any denomination. He taught ancient languages, and he had the school, the whole generations were his students on translation from the Church Slavic language and so on. Thank you, Yevgeniy. Do you have anything to add? Yes, I would like to say that really it is impossible just to protect the religious buildings from the fire. It is hard because they are very different, they are very tall, and there can be missiles when you cannot protect anything from them, S-300, S-400, for instance. There was a case in Hulaypole. There was the house of the priest destroyed, but it used to be constructed long ago. It was considered a local monument. That is in Hulaypole. And there are two pictures, how it used to look like before the shelling and after. The missile of S-300 fully destroyed it. And also we need to mean the character, the manner of these shellings. A very demonstrative story is the destroying, in fact, of the church of the Virgin Mary of the 19th century, which is in Mykolaiv region, in the village of Kyselivka. That was done on the 2nd of May 2022. It was destroyed and fully burnt. So the damaged and destroyed private buildings were close to it. How did it take place? First, they shot from the tank at the tower to put down the cross. They shot 5 times. The more they shot, the angrier they became. So they shot against the church. There were lots of incoming. There was the fire. So everything inside the church was burnt. They shot using different types of artillery and even cluster shells, as the witnesses say. And only after the 12th of November 2022, the priest and the nuns were able to visit the ruins of the church. Though some of the liturgy shrines were saved, but the icons of the Virgin Mary were lost. So this cathedral is fully destroyed. There is no roof. And in fact, it was destroyed, the plasterwork was destroyed, and there are really numerous cases like that. Thank you. Ruslan, please. Yes, thank you. I would also like to speak about this utopian option, but I cannot be silent about that. Because, as we've already mentioned, shelling against religious buildings is banned by the international humanitarian law. It is important to let the Russians know about that. If they understand that those are war crimes which they will be responsible for in the future, maybe one day they will understand that they shouldn't shoot against the religious buildings. And for that, at least our military, as far as I know, register the potentially vulnerable monuments of religious significance which exist in the combat area. Of course, we could give this register to the Russians and say, don't shoot there, but I would say that it wouldn't be a good idea. So that is why I think that such events like this one could inform this position to the international community, which has the opportunity of some kind of pressure onto Russians. And gradually they should come back to the norms of the international humanitarian law, which ban shelling against religious buildings. A short remark from me. During the 90s, in Kyiv and in other cities, there was such a practice when they started the active construction of new temples and churches. Not very frequently, but still there was a practice that the building, they installed a little tent, but the prayer hall was under the ground. But after they constructed a big temple, there was a kind of a lower temple under the church. We have the same in Bereznyky part of the city, in Troyeshina part of the city, in Kyiv, which underground is even bigger than the building above it. Since the beginning of this full-scale aggression, those lower temples were shelters. Some of the Kyiv schools, which don't have their own basement, are using the church underground basements as shelters for the children from the schools. Because the idea of the protective status of the religious building in the international humanitarian law is not only that this religious building has a certain cultural value, is not only because freedom of conscience should be complied with in spite of any combats and other circumstances, but also because this is the place which should be perceived by all of the sides as a secure shelter for civilians. This is one of its, in fact, meanings, at least according to the logics of the international humanitarian law. So yes, part of the solution of this problem is that all of the sides of the armed conflict should comply with the international humanitarian law. The best thing which could be done for the protection of religious buildings, and not only for other protected buildings, is, in fact, of the coercion of Russian Federation from the international community to comply with international humanitarian law. By the way, about the violation of the international humanitarian law, the cases, the facts of the destroying of religious buildings, do you plan to file a case against Russia? Will you collect that into one case, or shall we have the separate cases in court for that? Thank you. I may tell that as of today, a substantial part of the specific war crimes, except the or the crime of aggression for the higher commandment of Russia, certain cases like shelling the churches are investigated within the Ukrainian law, first of all, and by the Ukrainian law enforcement authorities. As far as I know, we are speaking about Article 438 of the Criminal Code, the war crimes. In fact, this article is not detailed enough. It does not separate churches as separate objects of attack, though there were initiatives to make more details in this article and to separate different types of buildings. As of now, it is not being implemented, and it leads to the situation that the majority of investigations are conducted not about the religious buildings, but they investigate the act of shelling. If they hit this or that village, if they destroyed this or that building, the school, the post office, and the church. So far, as far as I know, we don't have any specific proceedings about all of the cases of the destroyed religious buildings. Besides that, all of that, as far as I know, it is done in the regions. But there is an idea to combine them and to have a separate case on specifically religious buildings as a potential overall war crime or the set of war crimes. Maybe Yevgeniy can add more. I need to say that according to the Rome Statute, the religious buildings are combined with the attacks against medical institutions, educational institutions, the cultural monuments, historical monuments, and so on. So this is a very wide list of humanitarian various spheres and institutions. And I need to say here that here we can see that it is one of the elements of the military policy of Russia, that it wants to destroy Ukrainian culture as it is. So I think still that if I take this article separately of the Roman Statute, which tells us about that, then we can see that, well, I don't remember now for sure, but in how much of this data we have in the database about this crime, but it seems to me there are several thousands. It seems to me it's more than 7,000 of these type of incidents. So in fact, I think that we need to file a claim as the war crime, looking at the whole totality of the premises which can be considered under this article. I would like to say that our organization, according to the base of Tribunal for Putin, which I mentioned above, has prepared, in fact, the letter to the office of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, which is about shellings. So this case was also researched about these attacks. We hope that the prosecutor's office of the ICC could pay attention to see these type of crimes, because as we can see from our database, they are systematic and unfortunately widely spread, rather massive. They are large scale, and in fact they could take the investigation of this crime through this article. They could say that this was the war crime committed by Russia. But I understand that this is the huge amount of work on this prosecution, because those objects are numerous. That is why the prosecutor's office so far selects the cases which are much more obvious and visible, about kidnapping of children. Soon, I guess, we'll hear the announcement about the attacks against the Ukrainian infrastructure. Then we may expect that there will be an investigation of the murders, that is from Bucha district and other districts where they took place. and also forced kidnapping and enjailment of people on the occupied territories. Those which are occupied, they can be investigated. I hope we could deal with that. However, the work for the prosecutor's office is really large scale as well. Dear colleagues, are there any other questions left? Then I thank our speakers. Let me remind you that we were speaking about war crimes of Russian occupiers against religious communities and clergy. And Media Center Ukraine of Ukraine Forum will go on its work at 3 p.m. We'll be speaking about the disease X, whether we'll have the new pandemic and how Ukraine is getting ready to the potential threats. Thank you for staying with us.